Junie Byrd was sitting alone in a Harlem diner when four men in expensive suits slid into the booth across from him. They placed a briefcase on the table and opened it. $100,000 in cash, more money than Junie had ever seen in one place. All he had to do was tell them where Bumpy Johnson would be tomorrow night. The Genovese family wanted Harlem, and they were willing to pay handsomely for the one man who could deliver it. What those four men didn't understand was that Junie Byrd's loyalty couldn't be purchased, and disloyalty had a price of its own. November 1959. Harlem was caught between two worlds, the old ways of policy slips and protection money, and the new poison of heroin that was flooding uptown from downtown connections. Bumpy Johnson had just returned from his latest prison stint, older now, his health failing, but still commanding respect from every corner north of 110th Street. Junie Byrd had held things together while Bumpy was away. 10 years as Bumpy's right hand had taught him everything: how to collect without creating enemies, how to silence problems without creating martyrs, how to walk through Harlem like he owned it because, in many ways, he did. At 41 years old, Junie was known for two things: his unshakable calm and his absolute devotion to Bumpy Johnson. That Tuesday evening, Junie sat in his usual booth at the back of Sherman's Diner on 145th Street, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the sports pages. He wore a brown wool suit, a cream-colored shirt open at the collar, and a gold watch Bumpy had given him after the Lenox Avenue situation in '52. The razor was where it always was, tucked in his left sleeve, warm against his skin. The diner was quiet. A waitress named Dolores refilled his cup without being asked. Two kids argued over a pinball machine near the front. An old man ate soup alone by the window, watching the street like he was waiting for someone who'd never come. Junie had chosen this spot for its exits: back door through the kitchen, side door through the storage room, front door always visible from his seat. Old habits from the years when being Bumpy's man meant being a target. He was reading about Floyd Patterson's upcoming fight when the bell above the front door chimed. 4 white men walked in. Expensive overcoats, polished shoes, the kind of confidence that came from downtown money. They moved wrong for this neighborhood, too comfortable, like they'd paid for safe passage. Junie didn't look up from his paper, but his hand moved slightly closer to his sleeve. The 4 men crossed the diner without ordering, without hesitation. They slid into the booth across from Junie, 2 facing him, 2 blocking the exit beside him. The largest one carried a leather briefcase, which he placed on the table between them. "Mr. Byrd," the man said, smiling like they were old friends. "We represent some people who'd like to have a conversation about your future." Junie finally looked up, his eyes flat, revealing nothing. "I'm listening." The man clicked open the briefcase and turned it around. Stacks of $100 bills filled every inch. $100,000, the man said, "and all you have to do is answer one question." Junie stared at the money for a long moment. More cash than most men in Harlem would see in 3 lifetimes, sitting right there on a diner table between a sugar dispenser and a half-empty coffee cup. The bills were crisp, bundled tight with paper bands, the kind of money that came straight from a bank vault, untouched by street hands. The man who'd opened the briefcase leaned back, still smiling. He had slicked gray hair, a thin mustache, and the kind of tan you only got from winters in Florida: Genovese money. Junie recognized the type. Not soldiers, but negotiators, the men who came before the violence, offering a cleaner path. "Vito sends his regards," the man said casually, invoking Genovese's name like it was supposed to mean something. "He respects what you've built up here, respects your loyalty, but he also knows that loyalty has limits, especially when the man you're loyal to is sick, old, and 1 prison stint away from dying behind bars." The 2 men beside Junie shifted slightly, their coats bulging at the hip, armed. The fourth man, seated next to the speaker, hadn't said a word, just watched Junie's hands with the focus of someone who'd been trained to spot trouble before it started. "Bumpy's time is ending," the gray-haired man continued. "Everyone knows it. The question is what comes next. Now you can go down with him. End up dead or in prison like every other loyal soldier in history. Or," he gestured at the briefcase, "you can be smart. You can be the man who helps us transition Harlem peacefully. And in return, you don't just get the money. You get to keep operating, under our protection." Junie picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. The waitress Dolores had frozen behind the counter, sensing something wrong. The old man by the window was gone, slipped out without Junie noticing. The two kids at the pinball machine were still playing, oblivious. "One question," Junie said quietly. "That's what you said. One question for 100,000. "That's right. Simple. Where will Bumpy Johnson be tomorrow night? That's all. You walk out of here rich, and you never see us again." Junie set the cup down carefully. "And what happens to Bumpy tomorrow night?" The gray-haired man's smile flickered, just for a moment. "That's not your concern. That's the beauty of this arrangement. You give us the information, you take the money, and whatever happens after, your hands are clean." Junie nodded slowly, like he was considering it. Then he closed the briefcase with a soft click. "My hands," Junie said, "have never been clean." The gray-haired man's smile disappeared. The two men flanking Junie tensed, hands drifting toward their waistbands. The fourth man, the silent one, leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "I don't think you understand the situation," the gray-haired man said, his voice losing its friendly veneer. "This isn't a negotiation. You take the money and answer the question, or you don't walk out of this diner. Vito was clear. We don't leave without an answer." Junie didn't move. His coffee was getting cold. The pinball machine dinged in the background, the two kids laughing at something, completely unaware that four men were about to die 15 feet away from them. "Let me tell you something about Bumpy Johnson," Junie said slowly. "I was 23 years old when I met him, running numbers for a man on 132nd who liked to beat his runners when the count came up short. One night, that man beat me so bad I couldn't see out my left eye for a week. Bumpy heard about it, didn't know me, had no reason to care. But he walked into that man's apartment, sat down at his kitchen table, and explained, real calm, real patient, what would happen if he ever touched one of his runners again." The gray-haired man shifted impatiently. "Touching story. What's your point?" "My point," Junie continued, "is that man left Harlem the next morning and never came back. Bumpy didn't do it for money, didn't do it for territory. He did it because it was right. And when he found out I had nowhere to go, he gave me a job, gave me a purpose, gave me something I'd never had before." "And what's that?" "A reason to die for someone." The diner went quiet. Even the pinball machine seemed to pause. "You think $100,000 means something to me?" Junie's voice dropped lower. "I've watched men die for Bumpy Johnson. I've put men in the ground for Bumpy Johnson. I've bled on Harlem streets, spent nights in police cells, taken beatings that would have killed weaker men. All because Bumpy asked me to. And you sit here with your downtown money and your Florida tan, thinking you can buy what I've built with my whole life?" He pushed the briefcase across the table, back toward the gray-haired man. "You got the wrong man." The gray-haired man stared at the briefcase, then back at Junie. Something shifted in his expression, the realization that this wasn't going to end the way he'd planned. "That's unfortunate," he said quietly. "Truly." His hand moved toward his coat. Junie's moved faster. The razor was in Junie's hand before the gray-haired man's fingers touched his lapel. 8 inches of polished steel caught the diner's fluorescent light as Junie pressed the blade against the man's throat, just below his jawline. Not cutting, not yet, but close enough that a single twitch would open him up. "Hands on the table," Junie said calmly. "All of you." The two men beside him hesitated, glancing at their leader for guidance. The gray-haired man's eyes were wide now, his smugness replaced by the raw animal fear of a man who understood exactly how close he was to death. "Do what he says," the man whispered. 8 hands slowly emerged from coats and landed flat on the table. The silent fourth man was sweating now, his composure cracked. "Dolores," Junie called without turning his head. "Take the kids out back. Use the kitchen. Don't come out until I tell you." The waitress didn't hesitate. She grabbed both children by their collars, ignoring their protests, and disappeared through the swinging kitchen door. The diner was empty now, just 5 men and a briefcase full of blood money. "You made a mistake coming here," Junie said. "Not because you tried to buy me. Men have tried before, but because you threatened Bumpy Johnson in my presence, in my neighborhood, in my booth." He pressed the razor slightly harder. A thin line of red appeared on the gray-haired man's neck. "Vito Genovese sits downtown in his fancy apartment, thinking he can take Harlem because Bumpy's old, because Bumpy's sick. But Vito forgets something important. Bumpy built an army up here. Men who'd die before they'd betray him. Men like me." "We can talk about this," the gray-haired man stammered. We can renegotiate. More money, territory, whatever you want." "What I want," Junie said, "is for you to deliver a message to Vito. Anything. Name it." Junie leaned closer, his lips nearly touching the man's ear. "Tell him Harlem isn't for sale. Tell him Bumpy Johnson will die when God decides, not when the Genovese family decides. And tell him if he ever sends men uptown again, for me, for Bumpy, for anyone, I will personally walk into his home and show him what Harlem does to traitors." The gray-haired man nodded frantically. "There's just one problem," Junie continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. What problem?" Junie pulled back slightly, looking at all 4 men with an expression that held no anger, no heat, just cold, absolute certainty. "I don't need all 4 of you to deliver a message. I only need one." The silent fourth man moved first, lost his nerve, lunging across the table for Junie's throat. It was the last mistake he ever made. Junie's razor opened him from ear to collarbone in a single fluid motion. Blood sprayed across the briefcase, across the $100 bills, across the gray-haired man's expensive overcoat. The fourth man collapsed onto the table, gurgling, hands clutching at a wound that couldn't be closed. The 2 men beside Junie went for their guns. Too slow. Junie drove his elbow into the first man's nose, shattering cartilage, then buried the razor into his neck before he could scream. The man slumped sideways, blocking his partner's draw. Junie used the half-second of confusion to grab the coffee pot from the table and smash it across the third man's face. Scalding liquid and broken glass sent him reeling backward, howling, clawing at his eyes. Junie was on him before he hit the ground. The razor found its mark twice, once across the wrist that held the gun, once across the throat that held the scream. The man died staring at the ceiling, his pistol clattering uselessly to the floor. 3 bodies, 4 seconds. The gray-haired man hadn't moved. He sat frozen in the booth, blood dripping down his neck from the thin cut Junie had given him earlier, his hands still flat on the table, his eyes wide with a terror beyond words. The briefcase in front of him was soaked red, $100 bills ruined, money that had meant nothing to Junie, and now meant nothing to anyone. Junie stood over the carnage, breathing hard, the razor still dripping in his hand. His brown wool suit was splattered with blood. His cream-colored shirt was ruined. But his face was calm, the same unshakable calm that had made him Bumpy Johnson's most trusted soldier for over a decade. He reached down and grabbed the gray-haired man by his tie yanking him out of the booth and onto his knees in the middle of the diner floor, surrounded by the bodies of his colleagues. "You're the one," Junie said quietly. "You're the one who gets to walk out of here." The man was sobbing now, tears mixing with the blood on his face. "Please, please, I have a family." "So did they." Junie gestured at the bodies. "So does Bumpy. So do I." He released the man's tie and stepped back. "Deliver my message, word for word, and tell Vito something else." "What?" the man whimpered. Junie wiped the razor clean on a napkin and slid it back into his sleeve. "Tell him Junie Byrd says hello." The gray-haired man stumbled out of Sherman's diner and into the Harlem night, his expensive overcoat drenched in his colleagues' blood. He never stopped running until he reached a payphone on 125th Street, where he called for a car that took him straight to Vito Genovese's estate in New Jersey. By midnight, every made man in the Genovese family knew what had happened at that diner, and what Junie Byrd had said. Vito Genovese never sent men to Harlem again. The bodies were gone within the hour. Junie made 2 phone calls, one to Bumpy, one to a cleaner who owed favors from the old days. By morning, Sherman's diner had new floors, new booths, and a waitress named Dolores who suddenly couldn't remember anything about November 17th, 1959. The briefcase and its blood-soaked money were never found. Some said Junie burned it. Others said he donated it to a church on 138th Street. Anonymous, no questions asked. When Bumpy Johnson heard what Junie had done, he didn't speak for a long time. He sat in his apartment on 116th Street, staring out the window at the neighborhood he'd built, the empire he'd defended for 40 years. Finally, he turned to Junie and said 5 words that meant more than any amount of money ever could. "I chose the right man." The story spread through Harlem like gospel. In barbershops and pool halls, on street corners and in after-hours clubs, men spoke Junie Byrd's name with a reverence usually reserved for Bumpy himself. 4 Genovese men had come uptown with enough cash to buy a brownstone, and only one had limped back downtown, carrying a message written in blood. 9 years later, Bumpy Johnson collapsed at Wells Restaurant, dying in the arms of the neighborhood he loved. Junie was there when it happened, holding his mentor's hand as the great man took his final breath. At the funeral, over 7,000 people lined the streets. Junie stood in the front row, silent, his face carved from stone. He never spoke publicly about what happened at Sherman's diner, never bragged, never embellished, never told the story himself. But for decades after, whenever someone asked why the Italian families never truly conquered Harlem, why Bumpy's territory remained intact even after his death, old-timers would lean in close and whisper about the night Junie Byrd was offered $100,000 to betray his best friend, and what he did instead. Some loyalties, they'd say, can't be bought. Some men can't be broken, and some debts can only be paid in blood. Junie Byrd paid in full.